Okay, I'm going to ask you to check your prejudices and preconceptions at the door this morning, and bear with me because I'm going to say something that a lot of gamers probably aren't going to like to hear, and it's this. Services are probably better value for money now than purchases. Buying games has become increasingly untenable and a bit of a pointless exercise. And as I say, bear with me, because I'll explain what I mean. If you look at what's happening with games, and both physical and digital, it's becoming increasingly obvious that buying games is a risk. Many games have died not long after launch, and I can cite Battleborn and Lawbreakers. Now, those two games were practically online-only games, and so if you bought them, your investment is pretty much over. You've got something sitting on your shelf that's serving no purpose whatsoever. You could probably use it as a coaster, or you can maybe wedge the box under your door and use it to hold your door open. But other than that, it's a completely wasted purchase. We've seen many other games as well come and go. We saw DuckTales, I think it was last year, was delisted. It's since been relisted, but it just goes to show that control of those games is out of our hands. Recently, Onrush, the Codemasters game, was delisted from the Xbox store, and I think that was to do with the security issue, and apparently it's coming back in December. Back in the 360 days, Speedball 2 got a remaster, and that was a Bitmap Brothers game. That got a remaster, and I loved that game, so I actually got hold of that remaster. But if you want that game now, it's nowhere to be found. I still have it on my 360, and I can still play it on my 360. But if I bought a new 360 or I had to start a new account, I couldn't actually get hold of that game again. I could download it again because I already own it, but like I say, nobody else can get that game. We've even seen with games like Forza Horizon 3 and other Forza games as well. They've been removed from the store. Forza Horizon 3 was only recently removed from the Xbox store. And that, I believe, is down to licensing issues with audio. And you see this a lot with racing games or any games that have music. There's a limited time on the license, and they get removed. I think this happened with Alan Wake as well. It was removed for a while and it came back. And many of the games become either useless or severely cut down when the player base is reduced. Or, in some cases, the player base is completely gone, as with Battleborn and Lawbreakers. The servers are completely shut down, and then those games become utterly useless. And in that circumstance, I would say that subscribing to a service with a changing roster of games makes much more sense. You're less likely to be spending your money on a purchase, or you won't be spending your money on a purchase at all, that could be rendered useless when the company stops supporting it or brings out next year's iteration. If you're talking about next year's iteration, you only have to look at sports games like NBA or FIFA. And those games, well, it makes much more sense to look at those games as an ongoing service, if you like. I'm not talking about the games themselves as a service. Games as a service is something I hate. But putting the games into a service like Game Pass or PlayStation Now would seem to make much more sense to me. And obviously there's problems that we have to address with this, microtransactions and all the rest of it. And this has to be done fairly. And we can't really rely on the games industry to do things fairly. Nevertheless, if you look at FIFA and NBA at the moment, they already have pretty nefarious approaches to things like microtransactions. But taking that aside for a moment, if you look at sports games, if they were on a service, you could see the rosters could be updated every year and the gamer just carries on paying his monthly fee and carries on playing. Meanwhile, the company is, spending their time making the next version of the game without the pressures that you get with a yearly update and the need to continually make a new game to bring in new revenue. I mean, it's not like EA and 2K really bother much with their yearly updates anyway. So if you could create a situation where they could make their revenue and not keep trying to con us into buying a full $60, $70 game every year, then everyone could be a winner. And, microtransactions could be included in that model as long as it was, as I said before, done in a sort of equitable way, and the companies that made the game were continuing to make money, but we weren't getting ripped off. And okay, look, I know that's a bit of a tall order in some instances, but it's a possibility, and I can live in hope, can't I? The reality is that when you buy a game now, you have all those issues with the game may disappear. And, you could end up having a product that you've spent money on that is a complete waste of time. But there's also situations like with Black Ops 4. With that game, you bought it and you had your disc in your hand and you put it into the machine, but it wouldn't actually play without a day one patch. So, later on down the line, if you're trying to play that game and you haven't got an internet connection, forget it. And this is where we are now. And look, a lot of this goes against my gut feeling, as, I'm someone who prefers to have a product in my hand and, say that I own it. But we've seen with Netflix that the convenience of a subscription service becomes very attractive if the content on offer is of sufficient quality. And if you compare that against the actual ownership, then that becomes less and less attractive when it offers less and less. And look, we've seen over time that large companies care very little for the legacy of their products. With film, music, TV, radio, all of these things have suffered losses over the years in the sense that stuff has disappeared, product has disappeared, content has disappeared. In fact, there have been times when the only way to reissue a particular record, and there were stories in one of the hi-fi magazines I read some years ago, a reissue of a particular record was only possible because the company who wanted to do the reissue managed to track down a punter, a person out there, a member of the public who owned a copy of that particular record, because the company that produced the original had never bothered to archive it. And sometimes they do. And even if they do, though, they do a terrible job of storing it, and the master gets ruined and can't be used. And so these companies have to go and find somebody who has a viable copy that they can take that copy from and create a new master. And with gaming, well, this is even worse. Not only do gaming companies seem to care very little for their back catalogues, they even manage to make it difficult for enthusiasts to preserve older games by going after things like ROM sites. And I know some people don't like the idea of ROM sites, but when you go and look at Nintendo and you see that while they're attacking ROM sites on the one hand, they're going to those sites and downloading ROMs on the other so that they can put out a reissue of a particular game. And this has actually happened. When somebody looked at the code, they saw that it was a ROM from a ROM site. But, Nintendo aren't the only ones. I'm not singling them out. The ESRB, I think it was, took a museum in the States to court to try and stop it recreating servers for older games. And they stated, this is great, if they do this, anyone will be able to play these games. Well, duh. Surely that's the point. But these companies don't want that. They want control. But they want control while simultaneously not taking any responsibility and not looking after their back catalogues. And look, all this would seem to be an argument against services. If we can't trust these companies, why subscribe to the services that they offer? Well, because it's a balancing act. We can't trust the releases they put out to stand the test of time either. In many cases, they won't. And as the hardware dies and more games appear that won't work without a day one patch or an online connection, the whole issue becomes moot. We simply can't trust these companies at all. So whether you're buying the game or whether you're subscribing to a service becomes a matter of which one is the best value for money. And when you're subscribing to a service, you get that rolling selection of games and you're not ending up with a dead game in your hand that you can't use. Buying games simply becomes less value for money because regardless of what we think, we just don't own what we purchase. And I know I keep banging on about that, but that's the reality. And in that circumstance, subscriptions become a lot more attractive. And look, this is one of the reasons why I think the Stadia model is such a poor deal for the consumer, and why I think the Netflix model is better than Amazon's approach of subscribe and pay. Both Amazon and Google want you to still purchase the product. They just don't want you to own it. In a digital world, we don't, as I keep saying, own the products we buy. And so why not cast off the shackles of ownership completely and just subscribe? Subscribe to a service and just have an all-you-can-eat buffet. You won't have any control over what's on offer from the service, but then you no longer have control over the content you purchase either. What's more, services are cheaper, more convenient, easier to use, and they offer more functionality, often anyway. You've got the ability to have cross-buy and cross-play. You can easily share games with family members and so on and so forth. Though obviously, this is an area that could be improved, and I've talked about that at length. Game sharing on Xbox and PlayStation could be a lot better. But the potential's there. And look, I know the potential's there with digital purchases as well, but you still have all those issues with digital purchases. And obviously, services don't solve the problems of archival, but as I've already said, once you get away from actual physical ownership, where you buy a complete product and can hold it in your hand, well, that's already a problem. The fact is, where ownership of games is concerned, the horse is already bolted. Digital ownership is pretty much the definition of oxymoron. Seriously, it just doesn't make any sense. There is no such thing as digital ownership. And now there's no such thing as physical ownership either, because in most cases, that disc you bring home doesn't contain everything you need to play the game. And once we accept that and realise that the time of ownership is over in gaming, then, as I've said before, services become much more attractive. And in fact, they become the only game in town, whether we, as gamers, like it or not. But anyway, look, that's me done. You may agree, you may disagree, and if you do, let me know in the comments one way or another. And while you're at it, give me a thumbs up and all the rest of it, and subscribe and hit the bell and you know the rest. I'm going to go and get myself a cup of tea, and I'll speak to you in the next one. Bye.